Here on the 9th of December, 2022, for a conversation with Donald Barber. My name is Dave Brown, and you won't see me, but I'll be here having this conversation with Don. We're having this conversation this morning because Don grew up on Sotterley. And for those of you who don't know Sotterley, it's a historic property in southern Maryland that traces its history back to the 18th century. Don grew up on this property in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, that period.
Yes.
And he put himself through college on the back of a National Merit Scholarship.
Correct.
And went on to have a very productive and successful career in mental health. But the reason we're here to talk to him this morning is because for the last 25 years, he's been a member of the board of trustees of Historic Sotterley, and that being the organization that's running this property, Sotterley, as an educational resource for the community. And having served on the board for 25 years, he has the distinction of being the longest serving board member in the modern history of Sotterley. This has been a very momentous period for Sotterley, and our purpose here is to get Don's thoughts on the changes that have been taking place. As a bit of context, one of the ways of looking at this change relates to the way Sotterley tells its story about itself. And 30 years ago, that story focused on the 18th century and the white owners of the tobacco plantation that was Sotterley then, and their role in American colonial and revolutionary history. And the tours that took place at that time took people through the house and focused on the fine furnishings and furniture that the 20th century owners had brought to show the house off as an 18th century style home. Well, fast forward to the present. The way Sotterley tells the story is very different. It doesn't focus on the 18th century. It focuses on the whole 300 years to the present. And it includes in the history that it's talking about the story of slavery and information about the lives of enslaved people who were on the property, and the story of its role in the Civil War and segregation and the Civil Rights Movement. So it's a very different way of thinking about Sotterley. Now, Don may have his own opinion about what has changed in this period, but that's part of the context that we want to talk about this morning.
Okay. I do agree that the thrust of the story of Sotterley's changed quite a bit. I think the focus now and in the past, 10 years, now focuses more on the people of Sotterley instead of what I used to call it like a musty old edifice. Instead of this is a 300-year-old place and things happened here hundreds of years ago. Things happen things are happening right now as we sit here. So Sotterley, as long as there's people there, I think that's what gives it its life and its significance.
But could you tell me how it was that you came to be a board member and what made you interested in it?
Okay. At first, I didn't have an interest in being a board member because Mrs. Mabel Ingalls had set up Sotterley as a trustee. Instead of having a board of directors, had board of trustees. And growing up, we treated the trustees like they were like the ancient Greece and Romans treated the gods. Like these are people that even though they walk the earth, they're on a different plane than you are. So the opportunity to be a trustee never occurred to me because at that time, I felt that the greatest strength of a trustee was their ability to write a check because Sotterley did not have any kind of a guaranteed or steady income stream. So the trustees were, they had a fiduciary responsibility to ensure the continuation of the site. So I was a poor human service worker married to a poor special education teacher. So it never occurred to me that was even a possibility. So I was approached by Michael Whitson, who was at that time the president of the Board of Trustees of Sotterley, and he wanted to set up a meeting with me and speak with me, and I told him sure, because he was friends with the person that was a friend of mine, and I knew he was a real good guy. So I met with him, and he told me that Sotterley was looking to diversify its story and diversify its the makeup of his board of trustees, and that the fiduciary responsibilities would be nothing like they had been in the past. They were going to seek funding streams that would ensure the continued operation of the site and not depend on the trustee's ability to write a check. Because I told him if that was what he was looking for from me, you could forget that. So he didn't discourage me in any way, shape, or form. He said that what I had to give was my history and my perspective. And I was more than happy and willing to share that with anyone that was interested. So I agreed to join the board. And the other board members at that time were some people that were, I don't want to say wealthy, I'll say well-heeled. And they were very welcoming. They understood the mission, and they did everything they could to make me feel comfortable. So I was very happy that I joined the board at that time, and I ended up staying on for quite a while.
Yes, you did indeed. Yes. You alluded to the past of Sotterley and the way you perceived it. I think that at that time, Sotterley was sort of perceived as being an enclave for rich white people that wasn't very welcoming of African Americans.
It wasn't very welcoming. It was downright discouraging because we lived on the property down past the mansion, and we were not allowed to have any friends, and we could only have relatives as long as they remained extremely quiet and unobtrusive and just, not seen and not heard. So we didn't do a lot of socializing at home. We would just go visit other people.
So when you decided to join the boards, yes, what kind of reaction did you get from your relatives and friends about your decision?
My relatives and friends thought that Sotterley celebrated slavery. So they weren't what you would call supportive of my decision to become involved. They said if Sotterley was failing, let it fail. It'll be a God's blessing to the community to have it disappear. So I told them that Sotterley had a significant history, and that people of color played a role in that too, and the history needed to be preserved and had a value. And I said the lesson of Sotterley was not the good old days when you could actually own people. That wasn't the lesson. The lesson was that these people lived there and persevered, and they had hopes, dreams, and aspirations just like any other people. And the terminology at the time said, well, they had slaves at Sotterley. They didn't have slaves at Sotterley. They had people who were enslaved. And that's a major difference in terminology, because enslaved people are people. Slaves are just like a nameless, faceless automaton that performs a function. So that change in terminology really represents a huge, major shift in the way people are viewed. And it emphasizes the value and the humanness of the people who were there. And I grew to appreciate that. And that's why I was willing to join the board at the time, because when I spoke with Michael Whitson, he explained that that's the thrust of how they wanted to proceed. So I was well in favor of that.
Well, I'm glad you made that decision, but it's clear that it wasn't one that you had to have a little bit of personal courage to go ahead and do that. And yes, that's something I admire.
Well, I've always had personal courage because I didn't have a choice. I'll give you an example. When I was in the third grade, they integrated the school system in St. Mary's County. And it wasn't like everybody sat around singing Kumbaya, and this is a great moment in American history. It was like, you black children are invading our white schools. And as a matter of fact, my older sister was the valedictorian of her graduating class, and she graduated the year I went into the first grade. So she graduated in June, and then I started school that September. So my parents, of course, were extremely proud of her. And still are to this day. I mean, everybody in the family was very proud of her. But anyway, the teacher at Banneker, which was the black school at the time, wrote in my permanent record that I was an excellent student from a family of excellent students. So for some reason, that really rubbed the teacher at Hollywood School, which was the integrated white school. It really rubbed her the wrong way. So for some reason, she felt it necessary to call me up in front of the class and berate me. What she told me was that that I had no right to think that I was an excellent student, that I had come from what they called back then the colored school. I had come from the colored school, and that all white children were bright, and I would be very lucky if I could keep up. And God has an incredible sense of humor, because just prior to her telling me that, I had watched a little girl pick a booger and eat it, and I was horrified. I had never seen that before. And, so there's people in their superiority eat boogers, and I think I can cope. So plus, when I was at Banneker School, the teacher got me my own. See, the black schools at that time did not have books for elementary school kids, because elementary school children are rough on books, so they don't hold up. They, they throw them around and not careful with them, and they just get beat up, so they don't last. And at the black schools, we would get the books after the white schools had finished with them. So the white students would get the books and keep them they would use them year after year for 10 years, and then they would just pass them on to the black schools. So in the first and second grade, which I was at that time, there were no books left because they wouldn't hold up. They didn't last that long. So the teacher used to write our work on the chalkboard, and then we would just copy it on a sheet of paper, and that's where we would work from. So we didn't have materials, resources. We just had to make do with what we had.
It was a hard time. It was challenging, but
it was a challenging time, but you had to surmount. I mean, challenges are not, you can either let them defeat you or you can try to overcome them. And my parents were, because they worked at Sotterley, they saw something that the average African-American person in the county didn't see. What they saw and what they perceived correctly was that the biggest factor in a person's success was their level of education. And they saw that at Sotterley because there were people at Sotterley that were writers and poets and musicians and all kinds of things. And there were people that, cut the grass and rake the ground and different things. And they saw that the people who were the most successful were the most highly educated. So they put a overwhelming emphasis on getting the best education that you could. So what was available at that time was for us was the black school system with whatever meager resources they had, but my parents wanted you to make the most of it. So you had to do your homework, first of all. Like my mother, if we come home from school, she would turn the TV off. And then my mother could barely read and write because after she got older, we found out that she had a undiagnosed learning disability. So she could barely read and write, but she wanted us to be able to read and write. So she made an environment where schoolwork was paramount. You do your schoolwork. You don't sit there and stare into the television. In addition, my father, who didn't have as much education my mother had 8 years of education. My father had 6. And he said he was struggling at the, to complete that. That was a major struggle to get through 6 years of school. He was not a good student, and he very much realized that having a decent, good education was just a major factor in your level of success in life.
Right. Well, what you're saying, in a way, is that there was a need for change in the society, just at the period that Sotterley itself was going through, the kinds of changes we're talking about. One of the people who was responsible for making that change was involved in Sotterley even before you were. And this was a lady named Agnes Kane Callan.
Yes.
What was her role in the changes that were taking place at Sotterley?
Okay. Agnes Kane Callan was the descendant of a family that was enslaved at Sotterley. And she was a historian herself and had researched her family history and recorded it for posterity. And she, when she was involved with Sotterley, she was like a spark plug. She was a very energetic person, and her force of will pulled everybody along. So she valued the history of her ancestors and made it impossible for anyone to ignore that and to devalue that in any way, shape, or form. So she was a very strong force in the expansion of the story told at Sotterley and how it was told.
Right. And she had the thing, I think, an attitude towards her ancestors similar to yours, that she respected them.
Yes.
For having survived a cruel system. Isn't that correct?
Exactly. Yes. Right. She, what she did was, instead of emphasizing people's lackings and failings and things they didn't do, she made it evident that the things they did do, and that one of the greatest accomplishments, she said, was that they maintained their humanity in the midst of that type of a hostile environment. So, and that people even were able to express their individuality and their humanity in spite of having such a harsh environment.
As she came onto the board before you were on the board.
Yes.
And shortly thereafter, Don Hanson Briscoe came onto the board. And what was John Hanson's role? What's his history at Summit?
John Hanson Briscoe was the descendant of a family that owned Sotterley. His family, let me see, I'm trying to think. They owned Sotterley, and they owned slaves and enslaved folks at Sotterley. So
including Agnes Kane Callan's family, right?
Exactly. So the two of them actually, the two of them came to appreciate how their families were intertwined, and they were able to look at that from a objective perspective, and not in any kind of animosity or without rancor. So that was, I think, a major stepping stone in the progression of the telling of the story of Sotterley and the preservation of its history. What it did was it further emphasized the value of having a place like Sotterley in the community, and not that it's like some musty old place where you go and look and don't touch anything and, make sure you keep your hands off. That is a dynamic place that has a history that traces back, but the history continues to evolve and move forward as today. It just continues, yes.
Agnes and John Hanson got on in national television to raise money for Sodom.
Yes.
Did you ever see those videos? Yes. And what did you think of them? How did you feel about?
When I saw them, I had a great deal of pride. Um, and I knew John Hanson for years because I went to, when they integrated the school system, I ended up going to school with his younger daughters. So he had a daughter named Lisa and a daughter named Jan, and I was very good friends with them at Hollywood School. So I knew John Hanson from he would if there were after school events, he would come and pick us up, and he would give me a ride along with his daughters because we live right there in Sotterley, and he lived close by on Steerhorn Neck Road. So I frequently ended up in his presence, and he was just a very nice person. On top of everything else, he was very down to earth and very personable.
I think I agree with you that the two of them played a huge role in moving Sotterley forward.
Yes.
Now, there were some other people who were involved as well, and one of them was a lady named Marilyn Arrigan, and she was the education director in Sotterley. I think just started before you came out of the board, but did you have any contact or cooperation?
I had quite a bit of contact with Marilyn Arrigan because prior to Marilyn's tenure at Sotterley, they didn't have a good division of duties. Everybody did everything, and it kind of had evolved that way, but they hadn't separated people out. So I think Marilyn Arrigan was the first education director where they decided that the education function was so important that it needed to be handled by one sole individual. And she was the first person to do that. And she was so emphatic and so invested in her job that she brought her husband along, and he was another resource at Sotterley. I think he constructed a model of Sotterley that was very educational because it was a model of the mansion where you could place and move the different builds, different structures as the place grew and expanded. It started out as a little like 2-room dwelling, and then it just grew and grew as through the years as different owners added their own parts. And he built a model that you could, like building blocks, you could put it together and assemble it so it would look like the modern mansion, and you could disassemble it down to a little 2-room structure. It was very educational, very instructive.
Now, she also developed a new educational program.
Yes. She saw she was the first to visualize the whole concept of slavery to freedom, and what she thought. Because see, what they used to say at that time is there were slaves at Sotterley. There was Sotterley, and there was the important people, and then there were slaves. So she was the first to conceptualize the interrelatedness of everybody that was there, and she, in the sweep of history, she was able to visualize how people grew and changed, and how people that began enslaved gained their freedom, and then went on to live their lives however way they chose to.
So she was, in essence, writing a new story, correct part of the story, and shaping it so that it could educate young people in the community about those issues.
Very good, yes. And the thing that was most important was it tied everything together in a neat package. Right. Instead of being separate little like excerpts, it was all a sweep, whereas it evolved from one step to the next.
Another person who I think played an important role was Nancy Easterling, who became the executive director about 12 years ago. What impact did she have?
Nancy had a very powerful impact because Nancy kind of came up through Sotterley. She began as let's see, I think she was marketing director was her job, and she persevered at that and worked with the meager amounts of money that were available for that function, and stuck to it, and had a real personal investment in the continued functioning of Sotterley. And then she was eventually promoted to the executive director when the time came for a change in that position. And Nancy's greatest contribution, I feel, to Sotterley is her openness to supporting the diversity of stories and the impact and just the whole Sotterley story, the being able to appreciate the breadth of it and not get caught up in the beauty of the furnishings and any kind of a single aspect, and understand the totality of the picture was Nancy's strength. And she empowered people. She empowers her staff. She empowers the board. She helps people bring out what they have to offer. And it's a very positive experience being in her presence.
I agree. Now, one of the things she did was hire another person to be education director, Gene Turtle. And Gene got very much involved, I think, yes, in some of the changes that were going on. Helen, what impressed you about Gene?
Okay, we called her Jeannie. So Jeannie Pirtle was she was a person who was very hardworking at Sotterley, and she was very, very open and welcoming. And she had the ability to interact with people from different backgrounds and different perspectives in a positive manner, and to bring out the positivity that were in people of diverse backgrounds and interests and cultures. She had a powerful ability to get what's best out of everyone. And she was a very powerful motivating factor at Sotterley, because one of the things that you could feel was that she valued your input. So when you know that something that you're saying or doing has impact and is appreciated, it makes it that much easier. So she was a very strong factor in the positivity of Sotterley.
And as she was developing new ideas, she consulted with you a lot?
Yes, because she would get your, I call it buy-in. She would bounce ideas off of everyone and get your reaction. She wanted your unfiltered gut reaction to things, and then she would solicit your feeling of if it was a positive, if you felt it was a positive factor or something that should be downplayed. And I think that was a very strong factor in the evolution of the story of Sotterley.
And one of the things she was involved in was the reinterpretation of the site and the production of a first video about the history of Sotterley. I think you were involved in that video, weren't you?
I had a small part in that, yes.
What was that?
She had me, let's see, they did like a brief interview of me and one of my brothers where we spoke about our feelings about Sotterley and our experiences at Sotterley. And they took an excerpt of that and it included it in the marketing materials. So that was my involvement. And of course, like I said, she was very interested in my personal experiences at Sotterley, so she would always solicit that from me.
Right. And another thing that I think moved Sotterley along was its involvement in what is called the Middle Passage Project.
Yes.
And could you explain to people what that was?
Sure. The Atlantic slave trade involved the importation of enslaved people that were captured in Africa, and a very arduous journey for them would be packed in these slave ships and brought over to the United States. And there was a huge percentage of people that didn't make it, mortality. So if you were on, first of all, people were packed on the slave ships like cargo. They were chained and they were head to foot. And if you look at these old photographs of drawings that exist of people, and they're just stacked like logs on these ships they were brought over. And if you got sick, and the medicine at that time was poor anyway, and it was virtually non-existent. And these were people that were basically someone's property. And until they made it to the United States, they weren't anything. So if you died at sea, they just threw your body overboard and kept going. It was no sentimentality about it, or no kind of human feelings. It was just your cargo. You have no value. Goodbye, and then off you went. So,
Jean did some research, and she was the one who found the ship register that proved that the Generous Jenny slave ship had actually arrived at Sotterley Plantation in 1722.
Correct. The Bowles family saw the importation of slaves as a possibility, because, see, farming was hard work and the returns were not great. So they saw the importation of slaves as a possibility for a way of making a living. And one of the Bowles men, I think James Bowles, I don't know if it was first, second, or third, wanted to be a slave importer as a way of making money.
Right. Well, once she had proven that, we got involved in the UNESCO program to remember and consecrate the lives of people who died on the Middle Passage. And that brought some new people to Sotterley and new exposure for Sotterley broader than it had before.
Correct, because that focus helped to dispel the feeling that Sotterley celebrated slavery by illustrating the brutality of slavery and the inhumanity of the treatment of the enslaved people. I think it became harder for individuals that had pre-existing negative feelings about Sotterley to maintain that. Once they saw that the totality of the story was being told, as they say, warts and all, I think they became a little more amenable to the continued existence of Sotterley and the continued interpretation of history that was taking place at Sotterley.
It was a very important moment for Sotterley in that sense.
Yes.
Now, another program that Jean was involved in, which you've alluded to, and I think, was what we call our Descendants Project. And related to the Descendants Project, the idea of Sotterley being a common ground, a single place that could bring together the descendants of former slaves and former slave owners.
Yeah, I think the Descendants program is the outgrowth of the Common Ground program, because the spirit of the Common Ground program is the concept that the things that unite us are more powerful and more important than the things that separate us. And I think in terms of rehabilitating the image of Sotterley, I think that focus has done a lot of positives.
Hey, they had a couple of Common Ground programs.
Yes.
And you were involved in them. What was your role? What did you do?
In the Common Ground programming, I generally, because the focus of Sotterley for so many years was on the distant past, the what I would say recent, I mean like the last 50 years of what's going on at Sotterley kind of fell by the wayside. And my involvement was to talk about my experiences of growing up at Sotterley in the 60s and 70s, and kind of explaining why I wasn't sour and bitter. And that, if I could get beyond that, that other people should be able to do the same thing, because I had a hands-on experience with some of the things that weren't so great, weren't so enjoyable. So,
now, one final person I want to ask about is Gwen Bankins, who joined the board in the last couple of
yes,
and has gotten, I think, personally involved in Sotterley in a new way. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about her.
Sure. Gwen Bankins I found, is a descendant of the Kane family, which is Agnes Kane Callum and her family. And her family, Gwen Bankins' family, was relatives of the Kanes that remained in the St. Mary's County area. I think they settled near Leonardtown, and they always, she said, through family lore, had these horrible things to say about Sotterley. And once again, her impression was that Sotterley celebrated slavery, and that they had which they do, they have a slave cabin that still exists, and that they take tours through it and show people the slave cabin, separate from the mansion. The mansion's the big house on the hill, and the slave cabin is this little shack at the bottom of the hill. And she said that through the years, her family had just a negative impression of Sotterley based on that interpretation, and that she came to find that the story was much more inclusive and fully told than it had been before, and that you can't throw out one part of the story without discarding very important, very relevant factors. And she came to that realization and wanted to be involved because she said she felt that she could help to illustrate and emphasize the positivity, the people that endured and people that were able to evolve and move on from their previous positions. She felt that she could help to illustrate that.
Right. And you mentioned the slave cabin. That slave cabin has now been dedicated to the memory of Agnes Kane Callum.
Yes.
This year, Gwen Bankins organized something called the Day of Eulogy. What was that about?
It was a celebration of when you say Day of Unity, she was talking about the unity of the people of Sotterley. And like I said, once again, if you emphasize the people of Sotterley, the story becomes much more positive and much more of a triumph and a story of how the human spirit endures and prospers from its experiences. So no one wants to celebrate slavery. Slavery was a brutal, inhumane, dehumanizing thing that is wonderfully in the past. So as we head towards the future, you have to keep your feet planted in the present, which rests upon the things that were produced in the past, and move towards the future in a positive direction. And I think Gwen has understood that, and her Day of Remembrance and Unity was to further illustrate and emphasize that and bring people together, which is always great.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of things did change while you were on the board. If you look back at your time there, what are you most proud of, or think is most important in terms of accomplishments?
Okay. In terms of accomplishments, I think the change of Sotterley from a hands-off place to a part of the community and a community resource is the greatest accomplishment that took place during my time there. We want Sotterley to be seen as a community resource. It's a place that has value for everyone, and it has everyone can learn from it, everyone can benefit from it, and it's a place of tremendous natural beauty. So you can go there and enjoy yourself, or you can go there and do research and speak to people that have knowledge that they are willing to pass on.
Right.
So it's a great community resource.
It seems to me, listening to you and the story, that there was a lot of cooperation and collaboration and on the board of trustees during.
Correct.
Were there any ways in which you had disagreements with other members of the board?
The biggest and the longest lasting disagreement I had with other members of the board was what I call their deification of Mabel Ingalls. Mrs. Ingalls opened Sotterley to the public and made it a public resource. And that's a very good result. But she herself was a very imperious person, and she was a very, she really believed in the class system, that there are some people that are high class and people that are lower class, and it's a rigid system, and God help anyone that ran afoul of it. I mean, you had to know where you fit into the picture and respect that, or you would have to pay the price. And there was an individual at Sotterley who was part of the working class, and he very strongly wanted to be part of the elite class. And I saw her lay into him one time unmercifully. And she, as they say, put him in his place.
Interesting. Looking ahead, now that you're off the board, are there things that Sotterley should be thinking of as an institution that will move this process of greater diversity and inclusion forward, or are things on a pretty good path?
I think things are on a great path. And one of the things that Sotterley needs to continue is valuing the input of a more diverse population. Because one of the things that I found was a negative of Sotterley was some of the people that volunteered there wanted desperately to protect the old ways, and they wanted to perpetuate the class system where some people are better than others, and not among any of the staff or any of the employees, but among the volunteers. It was a very eye-opening thing for me to see, because I think they felt like they were getting status from their proximity to wealth and the grandeur of Sotterley. So I feel that to continue to move away from that and diversify the people who are involved with Sotterley and the backgrounds of people, I think will be the biggest strength that they have and the biggest guarantee of the continued existence of Sotterley in the future.
Great. One final question.
Yes.
You certainly contributed a lot these last 25 years. But I think you also mentioned that you learned some things from being on the board. You want to talk about that?
Okay, actually, I learned a lot from being on the board. It was a constant learning experience. When I first started on the board, I was extremely timid. I felt that there were other people that knew more than I knew, and their opinions carried more weight. And what I learned was to speak up, and that everyone's input has value. Now, the other issue, though, is that you can't really look hard at relative value, because then if you do that, you tend to lose things, because all input has value. And to judge the value of the input of another person devalues it automatically. So it was, like I said, it was a huge learning experience to just sit quietly and listen, let people say, because everyone's perspective is their own, and they came through it through their own. You look at life through the lens of your past experiences, and everyone's past experiences are unique and belong to no one but them.
Well, I think this has been a very informative, useful discussion we've been having. Is there anything else you would like to say before we bring it to a close?
I just want to conclude by just saying that I have great pride from my involvement with Sotterley. It's always been a positive for me, and all knowledge is good knowledge, I feel. And looking at things objectively from the past, first of all, it helps you to make sure that you don't repeat the mistakes of the past. You don't value them. You just put them in your bank of knowledge and experiences, and you take that information and try to make the best of it and make the most positive use of it as possible.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Donald, for sharing your thoughts. This has been a great interview, and I think people will very much appreciate your openness in sharing your point of view.
Well, I'm very appreciative of having the opportunity to share these thoughts, and I appreciate you giving me the platform to do so. Thank you.